I've been watching a lot of videos on YouTube about knives, and I thought I'd do one from my perspective as a soldier. Now, my perspective went from 1986 to when I retired in 2016, so it may be not so up to date, but it's fairly up to date. 2016 wasn't that long ago. So the first thing I thought about is, what do soldiers do with knives? So I thought back over my career and thought about what are the things that I did with knives the most. And probably the number one thing I did was open MREs. Now MREs are kind of sort of designed where you can grab the flaps and pull them open and separate the plastic and all the little pouches. Theoretically you don't need a knife, but you really do. For example, the main entree, you want to cut that sideways instead of vertically, and there's no tabs for that. So opening MREs was definitely one of the top things. We were always improvising things with parachute cord, so I cut a lot of parachute cord. I wanted a knife that could neatly cut parachute cord. Opened a lot of crates and packages, not only as a soldier, but as a private military contractor after I was a soldier, and that was more of a blue-collar job, and I just opened wooden crates, all kinds of packages, cut nylon straps. We were always rigging things for cranes and forklifts and tying down trucks, and sometimes the nylon straps would get hopelessly entangled, and you just have to cut these really thick nylon straps, seat belts. So there's a lot of logistics involved in war, so it can be like a blue-collar warehouse job at some point, or you could even be on the tip of the spear and a helicopter drops a pallet for you. You have to have a knife or something to get into it. Another thing is destroying enemy or friendly materiel. So let's say your position is about to get overrun and you have to escape and evade on foot, but you've left behind your non-tactical vehicle, Toyota Hilux. You might want to stab the gas tank or something to keep the enemy from using it. So you might just want to destroy your stuff or the enemy's stuff to keep it from being used. Grooming and minor surgery on self. So grooming could be something as simple as like cleaning under your nails with a pocket knife, or sometimes you get a blister or something and you need to cut away the skin, and you could go to a medic and bother the medic, but sometimes it's just easier to do that yourself. Breaking and entering, there's a lot of MOUT, we call it, military operations on urban terrain, or I guess the British call it FIBOA, fighting in built-up areas. But so you might need to use a glass breaker on the knife, for example, to break a window and go in, or use your knife to pry something, pry a door off a hinge. I mean, there's all kinds of breaking and entering tasks you might need a knife for. Camping and bushcraft. So just existing in the field, especially in the light infantry, was not so dissimilar from camping. So all the tasks that you see these bushcrafters on YouTube doing, you need to be able to do with your soldier knife. Cutting foliage for camouflage. That was something I used a machete for at Fort Benning, Georgia, for example. We were building defensive positions, and it's very obvious if you dig a fighting position and you've got all this yellow dirt that you've unearthed beside you, and you have to take measures to either cover that or hide that. Simple survival, so it could be anything from like cutting yourself out of a vehicle to you're on the run, having to survive, and you have to dress game, that sort of thing, butchering game. Then the unique thing that soldiers do with knives that bushcrafters may not is just fighting. So if you run out of ammunition and you don't have a bayonet, you may end up just using your knife to defend yourself, and it's a rare occurrence in modern combat, but it does happen. And then even rarer, throwing. I put a question mark next to that. I'm trained in a martial art that traditional Japanese martial art that includes knife fighting and sword fighting, and even though it may seem kind of ridiculous to throw a knife, and you don't want to, if the knife is your weapon, if it's your primary weapon at some point, you definitely don't want to throw that away. But if you have another weapon, you can actually throw a knife to get the enemy off on his heels, get him off balance, and then you can follow up with another attack. It's a very 1 in a million chance that you'd actually throw a knife and fatally wound someone, but it can be very distracting to have a knife thrown at you. And then also, I'm a scuba diver, so we might talk about some scuba diving applications as well. You always want to have a knife diving because you could possibly become entangled in fishing line or kelp, and you don't want to drown when your air runs out. So as I thought about it, I was thinking a soldier's knife should be ideally a cross between a fighting knife and a bushcraft knife. So I thought I'd show a couple knives that are optimized for each of those tasks. So this is the Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife that was issued to British commandos and special operations executive operators during World War II. It's sharpened on both edges, so I could slash a brachial artery going either way. It's almost like a needle, and it's designed so that I could stab somebody in the ribs and it would slide in between their ribs, or I could push down and sever the subclavian artery if I was removing a sentry, or come into the side of the throat and then use the slashing ability to sever all the veins and arteries in the neck if I was removing a sentry. So if I was going to remove a sentry silently, I would definitely select the Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife, but it's probably not going to be very good at bushcraft. For example, if I had a baton wood, it's double-edged, so it would cut my baton just as much as the wood practically. Another knife I have that's optimized for fighting was designed by my teacher Dan Rostahar, and he is a Croatian soldier who was a veteran of the Croatian War of Independence, or whatever you want to call it, after Yugoslavia broke up. But he designed this knife, and he is my teacher in the martial art I mentioned, which is Bujinkan Tanto Jitsu, if we're talking about knife fighting. And this is optimized. I can hold it in reverse grip, and I can use it for hooking motions. I can hook a limb and cut it simultaneously, but I can also have it in a forward grip and stab and puncture Kevlar vests, for example. So this is a knife that's optimized for fighting, but once again, I probably wouldn't want to use it for bushcraft. When it comes to bushcraft, I had another teacher you may have heard of, Cody Lundeen. He used to have a TV show on the Discovery Channel, Dual Survivor. He was on it for several seasons before he was replaced, but I went to his course in 2020. It's called Desert Drifter. It was a week-long desert survival course, and we went out into the desert of Arizona and just survived with a very few items, and one of those items was the Mora Classic. This is just a birchwood handle. I don't know if you'd call this a drop point or a clip point. Scandinavian grind, which is really good for carving wood. And it's a simple carbon steel. And I literally survived in the desert for a week using this. We did things like made an Egyptian bow drill set. Used a little knife like this. We were able to cut down willow trees to make sweat lodge. Just did all kinds of amazing things with this little Scandinavian grind knife, which costs less than $20. Last time I checked, you could look on Amazon. It's a Mora Classic. I forget exactly which version it is. It's like the middle blade length, but a very ancient and respected knife made in Sweden. And bushcrafters swear by knives like these. But the trouble for this as a soldier knife is there's no cross guard. And the handle is quite slick. So although the handle is very comfortable, if I'm going to sit around and make a bow drill set and be carving on wood for several hours in a row, it's not going to put blisters on my hands. It's a very comfortable handle. It's also very slippery. So if my hands were covered in sweat and blood and I was about to stab an enemy, it's very possible that my hand could slide down on the blade and end up disabling my own hand. So it's not an optimal soldier knife because it's not good for fighting. I want to talk about weight. So when you're a soldier, you're carrying maybe 100 pounds of stuff, and everything you carry has to be examined for weight. And I've always been a believer in those little Altoid survival kits. And one of the things that I carry in my Altoid survival kit is simply a razor blade. So I've read lightweight backpacking books. So there are some of these extreme ultralight backpackers who will backpack the entire Appalachian Trail with a 10-pound backpack, and some of them have used this for their knife along the entire 2,000-mile plus Appalachian Trail, so they can use this to prepare food or open packages of food or all the things we talked about for knives. Although a razor blade certainly would mess somebody's face up, it's probably not a very effective fighting knife though. At the other extreme end of the spectrum when it comes to weight is the British Ministry of Defense survival knife. And this is just an incredibly thick piece of metal, full tang knife, and it weighs at least 1 kilogram. I would not want to carry this on my person if I could avoid it. My understanding is that this is like a basic issue item that would come with a vehicle, but it's not really designed for soldiers to carry. But if I needed to baton wood, I mean, this thing is just like a wood grenade. It would be ideal for a lot of bushcraft tasks. I'm not sure about fighting. So it's got this nice cross guard. That's a good fighting attribute. I guess the drop point would penetrate well enough, but it's so heavy that it's not very responsive. But I guess you could be used in a fight. Another consideration is length. So I've always heard for a fighting knife, the minimum is 3 inches or 8 centimeters. However, for a bullet, the penetration is expected to be 12 inches. So this traditional Japanese tanto is about a 12-inch blade. So that would definitely reach any vital organs an enemy had. So length would be a plus for a fighting knife. However, the other constraint is weight. The longer it is, the more it's probably going to weigh. And it's just awkward to carry something long around. This knife is kind of like an Essie. It's made by the same folks, Randall Adventure Training, but this is an Ontario knife. I would not really consider this a fighting knife. It's more of a bushcraft knife. Choke up on the blade and make all kinds of fine work. I remember this knife came very dull, but I was able to sharpen it up. But the reason I bring this knife out is the sheath. So it's very important to have a sheath. And a knife like this, I've had for years. I can remember taking this knife to Korea with me once. I could tape it, I could duct tape it to the strap of a rucksack or my load-bearing equipment and have it inverted, and I could just very quickly draw this knife. The way I have it configured now, it's these holes are optimized for parachute cord. So I just, right now the way I have it is I just have a couple of lengths of parachute cord, and I've made belt loops for it. I can have it inverted on my belt and just reach back and draw it. And it's equally secure upside down or right side up or sideways. I think we're really getting closer to an ideal knife. And the Recon Tanto or Tanto by Cold Steel has several features that I like a lot in a fighting knife and a bushcraft knife. So from a fighting knife perspective, I have this guard on the bottom, and the handle is made out of some sticky material, so my hand's not going to slide. It's checkered, it's made out of rubber, and I've got this cross guard at the bottom to keep my hand from sliding onto the blade. However, if I'm going to use this for bushcraft tasks, I might want to choke up on the blade with my thumb. The other thing I like about it is it comes with well, it doesn't come with a trainer, but you can buy a trainer for it. So these knives are the exact dimensions, pretty close to the same weight. The only thing is the blade on this one is plastic. Once again, the knife snaps into this very secure sheath. You can use parachute cord to affix it to my gear, molly equipment, or just hang it from a belt. So the sheath passed the test. So I would say this is probably one of the top candidates for a soldier knife, the Recon Tanto. Another good thing I wanted to mention about this knife is if I have it in this forward grip and it has this sharp Tanto point, it can penetrate Kevlar vests and all kinds of things. So I can use it in this grip like this to stab or to slash, but I can also use it in a reverse grip. And one of the techniques I learned in Tanto Jitsu was simply, it wouldn't work with a double-edged knife. I'm using the dull back of the knife and I'm bracing it with my forearm, and I could strike up and hit somebody in the chin and then come across, bracing the blade with my forearm and cut their throat, cut their carotid artery or trachea, or come back down. So the reverse grip is a very good grip. So the fighting knife I would select would excel at the reverse grip as well as the forward grip. When you go on these other YouTube knife channels, you'll see all this discussion about knife steel. The main thing I care about is ease of sharpening. And something I found that is good at sharpening many knives is this Spyderco Sharp Maker. And it comes with a couple of different ceramic rods of different grits. And simply by taking the knife and sliding it down these ceramic rods in a specific order. It'll make just about any blade razor sharp. And so I have the ability to sharpen a knife, you know, using that as one technique, or simply with a stone. One knife I have that I think is got a good idea is this United States Air Force pilot survival knife. And it has a sharpening stone right here in this little pouch. I'll pull the knife out and pull the stone out. I can just kind of simply take the stone in between my index finger and thumb and just touch up the blade. So when people talk about these like super hard steels and they're paying $500 for a knife because it's made out of some fancy steel, you know, I know how to sharpen a knife, so as long as I can sharpen the steel. I like just plain old carbon steel. I think this is like $10.95. Most of the military issue knives are $10.95. Yeah, they'll rust, but I don't know, that's a cosmetic thing as far as I'm concerned, and I can fix that as well. Another attribute of a soldier's knife that's non-negotiable as far as I'm concerned is it has to be subdued. It can't be reflective. So for example, one of my very favorite knives is the Cold Steel Kaboom. I've got a war story about that I'll tell you later. But it's very shiny. Now I could hit it with some spray paint, but once you start using a knife, the spray paint comes off and you've got a shiny knife again. Starting in World War II, knives became Parkerized, so no discussion of military knives would be complete without the good old United States Marine Corps K-bar, also known as the 1219C or the Mark II fighting knife. This is a genuine K-bar one. It's older, so it has a sharpened on both edges of the clip point. And hey, my father was a Marine officer, and I have nothing bad to say about the Marines. And I actually carried this knife when I was a second lieutenant, first lieutenant in the Army on my load-bearing equipment. And one thing is, this is just not durable. It's made out of 1940s materials. They really hadn't even perfected plastic yet back then. The sheath is leather. So what would happen is every time I would set my load-bearing equipment down on the ground or whatever, the sheath would kind of bend, and the knife ended up poking through the sheath, and it would poke through my butt sometimes, or cut my arm or whatever, because the tip of the knife would be sticking out of the sheath. And the handle is also made out of leather. So these are all biodegradable materials. This Ontario Air Force survival knife has also got stacked leather handle. And I took it camping one time, and I woke up in the morning, and these little arthropods that we commonly call turd tumblers around here were actually eating the leather. I mean, so animals will eat, it's dead animal skin, so animals will actually eat the leather off of your knife handle. So a lot of nostalgia for this knife, but the problem with it is it's not durable. So you can watch all these YouTube videos of people very easily destroying a K-bar. I wouldn't want to baton wood with it, for example, because that would probably bend it, because it has this very thin tang going through the handle. I also wouldn't throw it, because that would bend it. I wouldn't do anything to abuse this knife. I mean, it's a good cross between a fighting knife and a utility knife, but the only problem with the K-bar is it's just not durable, but it's a classic. Something I absolutely cannot stand in a knife are serrations. And this is a Gerber, I think it's a variation of the Gerber LMF. They were selling this as the Gerber infantry knife. Like I said, one of the things that I did a lot as a soldier with a knife was I would cut parachute cord. And when you cut parachute cord, you want it to be nice and neat, not frayed. And then, once you cut it, you don't want it to fray, so you burn it with a cigarette lighter. So I've got some glow-in-the-dark colored parachute cord here. But if I cut it with a serrated edge, it just ends up fraying a lot more. And as the serrated edge gets dull, it frays even more. It's possible to sharpen serrated edges, and I can do it with that sharp maker using the corner of those triangular ceramic rods, but it's just more difficult. And I keep my knives sharp, and there's nothing I can't cut with a plain edge that I can cut with a serrated edge. But the serrated edge just makes a mess of things as far as I'm concerned, so I don't like serrated edges. And even though half the edge is a plain edge, I want the whole edge to be the plain edge. Again, one of the number one tasks I might need to do as a soldier that requires a bushcraft type knife is batoning wood. Now, normally you wouldn't be allowed to have a fire, as I've talked about in many videos, but if I got in a survival situation where I'm cold and wet and I need to start a fire and all the wood is wet that I find in the forest, I need to be able to split that wood and get to the dry wood inside, and for that I would want a knife that can do batoning. And again, the optimal thing for that would be like this MOD knife that has a very thin edge, but it's just like a wedge to pop that log apart. The other thing to consider is a 90-degree spine, which is used for scraping against the ferrocerium rod. I guess they call them ferro rods for short. And that produces a hot spark. I'm sure you guys have all seen that. But you have to have a certain type of, carbon steel, again, is good for ferro rods. And also just having that nice 90-degree, if it's rounded or something, it's not going to scrape sparks. It's got to be a right angle, like on this knife and most knives. Of course, you could always use the edge of the knife to scrape the ferro rod, but it's just going to dull the edge of your knife, and the temperature, the heat from the ferro rod might mess up the temper. So people try to avoid using the sharp edge of the knife to strike ferro rods, but it'll work in a survival situation. You probably care more about starting a fire at that point than keeping your edge heat treated. Like I said, durability is a big consideration for knives, and sometimes you'll find yourself using a knife for something it wasn't designed for, like a pry bar. But my solution to that problem was to start carrying a pry bar. This really came in handy when I was a military contractor in particular, and I'd be opening wooden crates that were nailed shut and things like that. So if you find yourself in a job that requires a lot of prying and you're prying things with your knife, you might want to carry this little lightweight sub $10 pry bar that you can get at Home Depot or any hardware store. And they come in handy for a lot. You can scrape with this end, and has a nail puller on it. It's a good thing to save your knife. Another consideration most of the knife YouTubers don't really talk about is you have to carry a knife that's legal in the jurisdiction you're going to. And I have a war story for that. I told you I had a war story about the Kobun. So in 2009, my unit deployed to South Korea to participate in exercise Key Resolve. And so I flew commercially, but I had all my gear with me. So I had my body armor, my helmet. We had, in Pelican cases, we had M4 carbines and M9 pistols. However, when I landed, I had this in my checked luggage, not in my carry-on, but in my checked luggage. And when my luggage came off the plane, there was a big yellow sticker, about 8.5 by 11-inch sticker in English and Korean and Hangul that said to report to customs immediately. So this little customs lady kind of grabbed me by the ear and drugged me over, and there's a United States Forces Korea liaison officer there at customs, and they had used their x-rays when I landed at Incheon Airport, Seoul Incheon Airport, and they realized that I had this knife in my luggage, and this knife is evidently illegal in South Korea. So fortunately for me, since I was a military member coming in, they had a knife amnesty box. And I think these cost about $40 at the time, so I had to throw my $40 cold steel Kobun knife away. And then when I got down to Osan Air Base, I went to the clothing sales, and sure enough, they had a bunch of Gerber fixed blade knives for sale. But I didn't buy one since I'd already been told that they were against the law. I just got like a little Gerber folding knife that I could use to open my MREs, and did without a fixed blade knife for that trip. However, yeah, it's just a consideration. So let's talk about some knives you might be forced to use simply because you're going to the United Kingdom or some other country that has oppressive knife laws. Maybe soon I'll do a follow-up video on folding knives, because I'm only talking about fixed blade knives in this video. But just about my favorite folding knife is a Spyderco Delica, so I just started carrying that. And I went to Korea many times. I'd go about twice a year for the two main exercises that they have, which is Key Resolve and Ulchi Freedom Guardian. And I probably did that for about 10 years in a row. And I just started carrying the Spyderco Delica. And this is also a pretty good fighting knife. And it does a lot of bushcrafty things, but obviously with a folding knife, you're not going to be able to baton or anything. But for the things I was doing, which was opening MREs and cutting parachute cord, this excelled. And I know a lot of badasses that carried Spyderco Delica 4s, so a lot of special forces guys would have this clipped to their pocket. So even though you might see some big 2-foot long pig sticker called a Special Forces knife. The real SF guys carry knives like these, and they're just using them for mundane tasks, like prying staples out of paper, all the things I use a folding knife for. A lot of countries have rules against locking knives, so the Spyderco Delica obviously locks in place so it doesn't close until you hit the back of it. So if you have a country that has a rule against locking knives, like some countries in Europe, you might just want to go with like a Swiss Army knife. And this is one that my aunt gave me when I was a little kid, and I've had it ever since. At some point I had it painted green, and the green paint pretty much wore off, but and of course you got your additional tools like a corkscrew and another knife blade and whatever you want for your Swiss Army knife. And since it doesn't lock, it's going to be legal most places. But some places are even more extreme, and I bought this knife because it doesn't have a point, so it's got a nice sharp edge, and I can use it for most tasks that I need, like opening MREs and cutting parachute cord, but it doesn't lock, and it has a blunt tip, so I can't stab anybody with it. So in extreme places that have extreme knife laws, I might end up carrying something like this. So it's good to have a variety of knives, and always check the knife laws before you deploy someplace to some foreign country, or even travel within the United States to different states. They have different rules, or different cities have different rules. So it's no fun getting arrested. You have to spend a lot of money on a lawyer. You have to, if you're in the military, you have to explain it to your chain of command. Your security clearance could be jeopardized, even though you just simply didn't know that something you had with you was against the law, like in my case in South Korea with the Kobun fixed blade knife. Another blade that's going to be legal most places that I really have gotten a lot of use out of over the years is a pruning shears. So I talked about using a machete to cut foliage to camouflage a fighting position. This works even better, and I can cut a tree branch as big around as my finger with pruning shears like this, and it's not loud. I mean, if you hit a tree branch with a machete, a lot of times it'll just bounce out of the way harmlessly. There's real art to it. You kind of have to hit it at a 45-degree angle, and that's difficult sometimes. Pruning shears actually work better than machetes for cutting foliage, even though they're not as cool and glamorous. I would recommend carrying pruning shears with you for fieldcraft as well. So we've talked about a lot of criteria for knives, and I've shown knives that I would and would not recommend. Now I want to start narrowing in on knives that I would recommend. And one that's near and dear to my heart, although it does have the leather handle problem, is the Mark III or M3 trench knife, or M3 fighting knife that the U.S. Army had in World War II. And the thing I like about this knife is it has all the advantages of the Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife, and that I've got this needle-like point that I can get in people's ribs. It's sharpened on both edges to a point, but then it's blunt here, so then I can use this part for scraping a fire steel. I can use my Bujinkan Tanto Jitsu technique of bracing the back of the knife against my wrist and cutting like this. To me, this is just optimal. The guard is not particularly bent on this one. It's like they tried to bend it, and maybe they had a quality control problem, but I also like the way I can index my thumb on the guard, and it fits in a bayonet sheath, because this blade was in fact adopted to become the M7 bayonet that was the Army's bayonet in Vietnam, and really from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, up until the present, some people are probably still using M7 bayonets. The other feature, a lot of these older, like Ontario knives, so we've got the Marine Corps, Air Force, and Army knives right here, and they have like this hard metal pommel, I guess you'd call it, that you can use to do things like hammer in tent stakes and hammer on things, crack nuts, whatever. It's kind of handy to have that. There's another reason I like the M3 fighting knife, and it might not have anything to do with my criteria, but my grandfather was an infantryman in Europe in World War II, and the way it worked with the M3 fighting knife is if you were just a regular infantryman and you had a M1 Garand rifle, they'd give you a bayonet for that. But if you carried a pistol, or if you were a paratrooper or a ranger, they would give you the M3 fighting knife. So my grandfather was just a regular infantryman, but he saw, I guess, paratroopers and rangers walking around in France and Germany, and they had these M3 fighting knives. and he wanted one, and yet he had not been issued one. So he wrote to his father, my great-grandfather, who was a metal worker, and he sent a letter requesting his father to make him an M3 fighting knife. And so here's a letter from my grandfather to my great-grandfather asking him to make the knife. And then I guess my grandfather had borrowed a knife from a ranger or a paratrooper, and he just traced it on a piece of paper and kind of wrote the specifications down, the leather stacked handles, the way the guard is. And you'll notice that my grandfather drew a straight blade guard. So anyhow, my great-grandfather, who worked in a metal shop, dutifully manufactured my grandfather an M3 fighting knife. So here it is. It kind of came in this like hand-sewn leather case that my great-grandfather probably made. And you can see the blade is almost identical, except it's made out of whatever steel my great-grandfather used. Sharpened, maybe the last third of the blade is sharpened on that side. The entire blade is sharpened on this side. We've got this flat blade on the back. We've got the place on the guard to index the thumb for holding it for fighting. Stacked leather grips. Basically an identical copy of an M3 fighting knife, handmade by my great-grandfather and then sent to my grandfather in World War II. My grandfather held on to this knife, I guess his entire life. I remember it being in my aunt's closet. I have an aunt who's about 7 years older than me, so she was still a teenager when I was a little boy, and I would see it in her closet, and I didn't know the history of it. I just thought it was this really cool knife, but I didn't realize how cool it was. And then eventually my aunt gave me the knife, and I still have it. It's my most prized possession, so if my house catches on fire, I'm going to grab this knife and my dog, and everybody else is on their own. Here's a side-by-side comparison of the M3 fighting knife and the M7 bayonet. And as you can see, it's the exact same blade. So the U.S. Army just had a big stock of M3 fighting knife blades, and they used it to make their bayonets. Let me just show you how it goes on the rifle. You might ask, why wouldn't I just recommend that soldiers carry bayonets if the M3 fighting knife is so great? And the only thing I can say about that is, when I was in the Army, they treated a bayonet just like a rifle. It had a serial number on it. When you took it out of the arms room, you had to sign for it. If you lost it, you'd be in a lot of trouble. So it probably wouldn't be a good idea to carry your own bayonet as a soldier, just because of the rules of the Army. All that said, having the additional reach of a rifle gives that bayonet that ability to engage enemies and that are not within stabbing distance. So if I was fighting an enemy with a knife, I would rather have a bayonet, but it's just not a good idea for soldiers to carry their own bayonet. It's like bringing your own rifle to the war. It's just frowned upon by the Army. The other thing I wanted to point out is that the sheath for the M7 bayonet and the M3 fighting knife are essentially identical. Notice how this is bent down. So even though the bayonet doesn't have that bent guard, the sheath is bent down, so it can also be used for an M3 fighting knife. So definitely one of my favorite. Maybe I'll do a drum roll special effect, because at this point I just want to go ahead and name the 3 knives that I would recommend. So if you're a new soldier and you're looking to buy yourself a knife, or if you're a mother or a spouse or a girlfriend and you want to buy your soldier a knife, these are the ones I would recommend. They're very inexpensive, and there's nothing here that's going to surprise anybody who watches a lot of knife channels. I'm basically recommending the same knives that everyone else does. But the first one is the Cold Steel SRK, which is a survival rescue knife. And this knife is just optimized. Survival Lily is a YouTuber who has lots and lots of subscribers, and she's quite the authority on bushcraft. And for years, she claimed that the Cold Steel SRK was the best bushcraft knife. So she wasn't even considering fighting. She was just thinking about bushcraft. So all those bushcraft tasks, the SRK is the best. And it's also a really good fighting knife. It's got that same exact handle as the Recon Tanto. So I can get my thumb over the top of the blade to do fine work. I can even choke up on it and put my finger here in front of the guard. So if I'm really whittling something or making a bow drill set, it's got the 90-degree spine for a ferro rod. easy to sharpen. It comes in all kinds of different steels, so you can pay whatever you want for it, but I would just get the least expensive one, which is like, I don't know, D2 stainless steel or something like that. The SRK, you can get it for like $40 on Amazon if you get the plain Jane steel version. It's got the paint, so it's not going to be reflecting light. It's just really optimal. So everybody loves this knife, including me. Sorry to bore you. I wish I had a more exotic knife to show you, but for price, fighting ability, and bushcraft ability, you can't beat the SRK. And this is just to show that the SRK and the Recon Tanto have the exact same handle. And I would also recommend the Recon Tanto without reservation. It's a little more of a fighting knife because it has a longer blade, but it can still do batoning wood and all those bushcraft things. Maybe that's just, the SRK might be better at bushcraft, and the cold steel Recon Tanto might be better at fighting, but they're essentially very close as far as being optimal knives for soldiers. And the other knife that's not going to surprise anybody is the Gerber Strong Arm. Now it's funny because I really despise that LMF2 that I have. I don't like the serrations. I don't like the, it's just too fancy. The sheath has just got too much. But the Strong Arm is the opposite. It's just a little lighter knife. Just ideal configuration. So you can do all those bushcraft things. It's got this nice guard on it, but you can also get your thumb over the guard. It's not going to dig into your thumb or anything like that. So if you're doing bushcrafty things, you can do that. And it's nice camouflaged color, so it's great for soldiers. It's also got this little glass breaker on the back, so if you need to bash in a window or something like that, you can do that. Very durable. There's YouTube videos of people just abusing the heck out of this knife, so you can use it as a pry bar if you have to. You can throw it if you have to. It's balanced well. So yeah, the Gerber Strong Arm, I think it's like $90 on Amazon, and I was in clothing sales at Fort Belvoir, Virginia the other day, and they had them for $80. I guess they just give a soldiers a little break because clothing sales isn't making a profit. Kind of lets you know what the profit margin is for the retailers. It's probably about 10 bucks. But yep, everybody loves this knife, and so do I. The sheath is really nice on the Gerber Strong Arm as well. So it can be carried scout carry by putting a belt loop through this way, and then it looks like this on the back of your belt, or it can be integrated with molly gear with these little straps, or there's just a lot of different ways. You can take this clip off, and then you can just duct tape it to a rucksack strap or LBE strap. The other thing about these knives, the Recon Tanto, the SRK, and the Gerber Strong Arm, is there's no reason why you couldn't scuba dive with any of these knives. You can just tape it to your buoyancy control vest, and especially the SRK would be an excellent dive knife. It's made out of stainless steel, rubber handle. You can't really dive with something like a K-bar or the M3 fighting knife because the stacked leather handle would just deteriorate in the salt weather so quickly. So once again, just comes down to 3 knives, really 2 probably, the cold steel SRK and the Gerber Strong Arm. So those are my recommendations for soldier knives.